The honest answer to whether you should mow high or low this August is that it genuinely depends on what grass is actually growing in your yard. And anyone who gives you a single universal number without asking that question first is guessing. This is one of those lawn care questions where the real answer is more useful than the simple one, because the wrong height for your specific grass type can quietly undo almost everything else you do right this month, from watering to feeding to weed control. So instead of a one-line answer, I'm going to walk you through exactly why height matters, what the actual numbers are for every common lawn grass, and why one of the most popular grasses in the country is the complete exception to almost every rule you have probably heard. By the end of this, you should be able to look at your own lawn, identify what you're actually growing, and know with genuine confidence exactly where your mower deck should sit for the rest of the month, rather than repeating whatever number a neighbor or a random online comment happened to mention. Quick note before we get into it, since this is exactly the kind of thing people ask me about constantly. If you're tired of guessing what your specific lawn actually needs and want a real plan instead of generic advice, I wrote a short ebook that walks you through your grass type in detail. Month by month, scan the QR code on screen or check the link in the description if you want a copy. Now let's get into the actual science. Every blade of grass you cut off is leaf tissue the plant was using for photosynthesis, meaning it was actively converting sunlight. The honest answer to whether you should mow high or low this August is that it genuinely depends on what grass is actually growing in your yard. And anyone who gives you a single universal number without asking that question first is guessing. This is one of those lawn care questions where the real answer is more useful than the simple one, because the wrong height for your specific grass type can quietly undo almost everything else you do right this month, from watering to feeding to weed control. So instead of a one-line answer, I'm going to walk you through exactly why height matters, what the actual numbers are for every common lawn grass, and why one of the most popular grasses in the country is the complete exception to almost every rule you have probably heard. By the end of this, you should be able to look at your own lawn, identify what you're actually growing, and know with genuine confidence exactly where your mower deck should sit for the rest of the month, rather than repeating whatever number a neighbor or a random online comment happened to mention. Quick note before we get into it, since this is exactly the kind of thing people ask me about constantly. If you're tired of guessing what your specific lawn actually needs and want a real plan instead of generic advice, I wrote a short ebook that walks you through your grass type in detail. Month by month, scan the QR code on screen or check the link in the description if you want a copy. Now let's get into the actual science. Every blade of grass you cut off is leaf tissue the plant was using for photosynthesis, meaning it was actively converting sunlight into the energy the plant needs to grow, repair itself, and push roots deeper into the soil. Cut too much of that tissue away in a single pass, and you're not just changing how the lawn looks. You're directly reducing how much energy the plant has available at exactly the moment August heat is already draining its reserves. Think of it as removing a chunk of the plant's own solar panels right when it needs the most power it can generate, just to keep its root system alive. This is the entire reason the 1/3 rule exists across every single grass type, without exception. Never remove more than 1/3 of the total blade length in one mow, regardless of what height you're ultimately aiming for, since taking more than that shocks the plant and forces it to spend energy on recovery instead of survival. A lawn sitting at 3 inches that gets cut down to 1 inch in a single pass has lost 2/3 of its leaf surface in one afternoon, and no grass cool season or warm season handles that kind of sudden loss well in the middle of summer heat. There's a second mechanism working alongside this too. Taller grass shades the soil surface underneath it, and that shade keeps the soil noticeably cooler and slower to dry out than bare or thinly covered soil sitting in direct sun roots. Growing in that cooler, more consistently moist soil tend to push deeper looking for stable moisture, while roots under short, heavily exposed turf tend to stay shallow, since there's less incentive to grow down when moisture disappears from the surface layer almost as fast as it arrives. This is not a small or theoretical difference either. Bare or thinly shaded soil in direct August sun can run measurably hotter and dry out considerably faster than the same soil sitting under a full canopy of taller grass, and that gap widens the longer a heat wave stretches on, which is exactly why the height decision you make now compounds in importance, the longer the hot weather continues. Picture 2 identical patches of soil sitting side by side, one under grass cut to 2 inches and one under grass cut to 4, both watered on the exact same schedule. By the middle of a multi-day heat wave, the shorter patch is very likely drying out and heating up noticeably faster than the taller one, simply because it has less living canopy standing between the sun and the ground, even though both patches technically receive the same amount of water at the same time. For cool season grasses, meaning fescue, bluegrass, and ryegrass, the case for mowing high in August is about as close to universal as lawn care advice gets. Tall fescue does best somewhere between 3 and 4 inches through the hottest stretch of the year, and Kentucky bluegrass sits a bit lower, generally 2.5 to 3.5 inches, Perennial ryegrass, often mixed in with one or both of those other two species in a blended lawn, does best held in a similar range to bluegrass, roughly 2.5 to 3 inches, and it tends to show heat stress a bit faster than fescue if kept too short, since it has a shallower natural root system to begin with. These grasses slow down and enter a defensive, semi-dormant state once daytime temperatures sit consistently in the 80s and above, and mowing them short during that stretch strips away the shade they are relying on to keep their root zone survivable, right when they have the least spare energy to compensate for the added stress. If your cool season lawn has been looking a little rough this summer, checking your mower deck height is one of the first cheapest things worth confirming before assuming the problem is something more complicated. Since a lot of homeowners spend money on fertilizer or pest treatments chasing a problem that a simple deck height adjustment would have solved for free. Warm season grasses tell a genuinely different story, and understanding why requires a quick detour into how these grasses actually grow. Cool season grasses grow in individual clumps, called bunch-type growth, with the plant's growing point sitting up higher on the stem as the season progresses. Warm season grasses like Bermuda, zoysia, and centipede spread horizontally instead, through above-ground runners called stolons or below-ground runners called rhizomes, which means the plant's growing point sits low, close to the soil surface, almost regardless of how tall the visible canopy has gotten. That structural difference is the whole reason. Warm season grasses can tolerate a much shorter cut without damaging the actual growing point. The way scalping a cool season lawn would, cutting a Bermuda or zoysia lawn short does not remove the plant's ability to regrow the way it would on a tall fescue lawn cut down to the same height, since the growing point was never up where the mower blade reached in the first place. This is also part of why warm season lawns can handle far more frequent mowing during their peak growing months without the same cumulative stress. A cool season lawn would experience under an identical schedule, since each cut is removing new leaf growth above an intact protected growing point rather than risking that point itself. With that mechanism in mind, here are the actual numbers. Common Bermuda grass does well somewhere between 1 and 2 inches, and hybrid Bermuda varieties bred for a tighter, more manicured look can handle even shorter, down toward 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches, though cutting that low cleanly generally requires a reel mower rather than a standard rotary mower, since a rotary blade tends to tear rather than cleanly slice grass at that extreme a height. Bermuda also happens to be one of the fastest growing common lawn grasses during peak summer heat, which means it typically needs mowing every 5 to 7 days during August, considerably more often than most cool season lawns are being cut during the same stretch, since skipping a week or two on a fast-growing Bermuda lawn almost guarantees you will be violating the 1/3 rule the next time you do get around to it, leaving you facing exactly the kind of aggressive, stressful catch-up mow this whole video is trying to help you avoid. Zoysia sits in a similar height range, generally 1 to 2.5 inches depending on the specific variety, with some of the finer bladed cultivars tolerating an even tighter cut, though zoysia grows noticeably slower than Bermuda and can often stretch to a mowing interval of 7 to 14 days without the same buildup risk. Centipede grass, which is naturally a lower maintenance, slower growing option, does best kept between 1 and 2 inches, and pushing it shorter than that tends to stress a grass that was never bred for aggressive tight mowing in the first place. Since centipede was specifically developed and popularized as a low input option for homeowners who wanted a reasonable looking lawn without Bermuda's demanding maintenance schedule. Getting these specific numbers dialed in for your exact grass variety, rather than working off a rough guess, is exactly the kind of detail the ebook I put together walks you through. The QR code is on screen now, or grab the link in the description if you want to check it out. It is worth pausing on the mower itself for a moment, since the equipment sitting in your garage genuinely limits what height is realistic to maintain. A standard rotary mower, the kind most homeowners own, struggles to make a clean even cut much below about 1.5 inches, since the spinning blade relies on enough leaf length to slice through cleanly, and pushing it lower than that tends to produce a scalped, uneven, almost shredded look rather than a crisp cut. A reel mower, which cuts with a scissor-style action between a spinning cylinder of blades and a fixed bottom blade, handles those very low heights far more cleanly, which is exactly why golf courses and lawns aiming for that tight manicured hybrid Bermuda look almost always rely on one. If you're running a standard rotary mower and your grass type technically tolerates a height below 1.5 inches, it is often more realistic to settle for the top of that low range, rather than chasing a number your equipment genuinely cannot deliver cleanly. Buffalo grass, a lower maintenance warm season option popular in drier regions, is worth a quick mention here too, since it sits apart from the Bermuda and zoysia crowd, doing best somewhere around 2 to 3 inches for a lawn mowed weekly, or left even taller, closer to 3 to 4 inches, for anyone happy mowing only occasionally through the season, since it is naturally a shorter, slower growing grass that does not need or want the aggressive low maintenance regime. Bermuda tends to get, now for the exception that genuinely surprises a lot of people, St. Augustine grass, one of the most widely grown warm season lawns across the Gulf Coast and much of the South, wants to be mowed tall, generally somewhere between 2.5 and 4 inches, and several turf guides are explicit that it should never go below about 3 inches at all. This runs completely against the instinct that warm season automatically means short, and the reason comes down to the plant's physical structure rather than its growth habit. St. Augustine has notably broad, coarse leaf blades compared to Bermuda or Zoysia, and that wider blade surface needs more length to support healthy photosynthesis and to properly shade the stolons running along the soil surface. Scalping St. Augustine below that 3-inch floor does not just weaken the grass cosmetically, it has been directly linked to a higher rate of chinch bug infestations and brown patch fungal outbreaks, since a scalped, stressed lawn with its stolons exposed to direct sun and heat becomes noticeably more vulnerable to both problems at once. The connection makes sense once you think it through. Chinch bugs thrive in hot, dry, sun-baked conditions, and a lawn scalped short with its soil surface fully exposed creates exactly that environment right at ground level, essentially rolling out a welcome mat for the exact pest most likely to devastate this specific grass. If you're growing St. Augustine and have been mowing it the way a Bermuda lawn down the street gets mowed, that mismatch alone could explain a surprising amount of the trouble your lawn has been having this summer. And it is one of the most common grass identification mistakes homeowners make, assuming all warm season grass follows the same short mowing playbook when St. Augustine very specifically does not. It is worth addressing the other side of this question too, since mowing high is not automatically a magic fix with zero downsides in every situation. Zoysia in particular gets called out by turf researchers for a specific risk tied to letting it grow too tall between cuts, since its extremely dense growth habit means a lawn allowed to get significantly overgrown produces an enormous volume of thick clippings in a single mow, and that heavy volume can smother the grass underneath and contribute to a thatch layer building up faster than it otherwise would. The fix here is not to mow shorter than Zoysia actually wants, but to mow more frequently so you're never removing more than that. 1/3 rule allows in a single pass, keeping the volume of clippings manageable each time rather than letting the grass get away from you and then hacking it back all at once. There's also a legitimate concern around canopy density and airflow at soil level. A lawn mowed unusually tall and allowed to grow thick and dense can trap a bit more humidity right at the soil surface than a more moderately maintained lawn, which in theory could favor certain fungal issues in an already humid climate, since a dense canopy slows the breeze that would otherwise help grass blades dry off after dew or an early morning watering session. In practice, this risk is small compared to the much larger risk that comes from cutting too short. And for the overwhelming majority of home lawns, erring toward the top of your grass type's recommended range remains the safer call through the hottest stretch of summer. But it is worth knowing the trade-off exists rather than assuming taller is unconditionally better in every single respect. There is one more practical downside worth mentioning too, which is simply that taller grass hides more. Pet waste, small toys, sprinkler heads, and tripping hazards all become genuinely harder to spot in a 3 or 4 inch lawn than a closely cropped one, which is a purely cosmetic and practical trade-off rather than a plant health issue. But it is real enough that some households weigh it into the decision anyway, particularly households with young children or pets spending a lot of time out on the grass during the summer months. If your lawn has gotten away from you and sits well above where it should be, resist the urge to bring it back down to the ideal height in one aggressive cut. Raise the deck 1 notch higher than your current setting, mow, wait 2 or 3 days, then lower it again and take another pass, repeating until you reach the actual target height for your grass type. This gradual approach respects the 1/3 rule at every single step, rather than shocking the plant with one dramatic cut. And it is a genuinely important habit during August specifically, since a plant already dealing with heat stress has far less capacity to recover from an aggressive scalping than the same plant would in the milder conditions of spring or fall. It is worth checking that your mower is actually cutting at the height you think it is too, since deck height dials are notoriously imprecise on a lot of consumer mowers, and a setting labeled 3 inches can genuinely cut anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 depending on tire pressure, uneven ground, and how worn the deck adjustment mechanism has gotten over the years. A quick way to check without any special tools is placing a ruler flat on a hard level surface, like a driveway, lowering the mower deck onto that same surface, and measuring the actual gap between the blade and the ground directly, comparing that real number against whatever the dial claims. A 2-minute check that most homeowners have genuinely never bothered to run even once since buying their mower. Doing this once at the start of the season, and again partway through summer, if the mower has taken any hard bumps, catches a surprisingly common source of mowing height mistakes that has nothing to do with knowing the right number and everything to do with the equipment, simply not delivering the number you set it to. Uneven tire pressure is a particularly sneaky culprit here, since a mower with one side running noticeably lower on air than the other will cut that side of the deck closer to the ground than the number on the dial suggests, leaving faint stripes of slightly scalped grass running through an otherwise correctly mowed lawn without any obvious explanation until you actually check the tires themselves. Mowing frequency and mowing height are also more closely linked than most people treat them. and adjusting one without thinking about the other tends to create problems. A lawn mowed at the correct height, but only once every 2 or 3 weeks during peak summer growth, almost certainly violates the 1/3 rule by the time you actually get to it. Since warm season grasses especially can put on a surprising amount of growth in a single week of good conditions. Matching your mowing frequency to how fast the lawn is actually growing rather than a fixed weekly or bi-weekly habit carried over from a different season keeps you hitting your target height consistently instead of only on the days you happen to catch it at the right moment. Figuring out exactly which category your own lawn falls into starts with correctly identifying what you're actually growing, since a surprising number of homeowners are not entirely sure. Cool season grasses tend to stay green through winter across most of the country and visibly struggle during the hottest weeks of summer, while warm season grasses go dormant and brown over winter and hit their most vigorous growth right in the middle of summer heat. Once you know which broad category you're in, narrowing down the specific grass, whether that means comparing blade width and texture, checking how the grass spreads, or simply asking whoever installed or seeded the lawn originally, tells you exactly where in that category's range your mower deck should actually sit. A lot of older lawns, especially ones that have been overseeded or patched up over the years, without much thought to matching the original grass, end up as a genuine mix of 2 or even 3 different species growing side by side. In that situation, the practical move is mowing at the height the taller, more sensitive grass in the mix actually needs, since cutting to satisfy the shorter tolerant grass almost always ends up scalping whatever cool season or St. Augustine grass is mixed in alongside it. It is a small compromise, and the more aggressive spreader in the mix may slowly gain ground over the more sensitive one regardless of what you do. But mowing for the most vulnerable grass present protects the overall look and health of the lawn far better than mowing for the toughest one, and accepting damage to everything else. If you genuinely cannot tell what is growing in a mixed lawn like this, a photo compared against a few reference images of common local grasses, or a quick question to a nearby extension office, usually clears up the identification faster than trial and error ever would. Climate and region shift these numbers slightly too, and it is worth treating the ranges given so far as a solid starting point rather than an absolute law carved in stone. In consistently humid high rainfall regions, staying toward the lower end of your grass, type's safe range can help airflow at the soil surface and reduce disease pressure slightly. Since the extra humidity in the air already pushes conditions toward fungal growth without a dense, tall canopy adding to it, in hot, dry, sun-blasted regions, the opposite logic applies, and staying toward the upper end of the range matters even more than usual. Since the shading benefit for the soil underneath becomes considerably more valuable when rainfall is scarce and evaporation is working against you around the clock. Local extension offices, whether that is a university agricultural extension program or a regional turf association, often publish numbers fine-tuned for exactly this kind of local climate variation, and checking one of those resources for your specific area is a reasonable next step if you want a number more precise than a general national range can offer. Especially if you live somewhere with a climate that does not fit neatly into either the classic humid southeast or the classic dry southwest pattern most general guides are written around. None of this height guidance works in isolation either, and it is worth remembering that mowing height interacts directly with the other decisions you're making about the lawn this month. A lawn mowed correctly tall but still getting shallow, daily watering does not get the full benefit of that extra shade. Since the roots never get the incentive to actually grow down into the cooler soil, the taller canopy is protecting. Similarly, a lawn mowed at the right height, but still getting hit with nitrogen fertilizer during the hottest weeks, ends up forcing new growth the plant cannot properly support, undermining a lot of the benefit the correct mowing height was providing in the first place. Getting the height right is a genuinely important piece of the puzzle, but it works best as part of a coordinated approach rather than a single fix expected to compensate for mistakes happening everywhere else in the routine. Think of the correct mowing height as the foundation the rest of your August lawn care sits on top of. Get it wrong, and even a perfect watering schedule and a well-timed feeding program are working against a plant with less shade,